She smiled at me that night, a little hesitant, and whispered, "I forgot how good it feels to be wanted." In that moment, I realized this wasn't just her story of love lost, it was the beginning of ours. I wasn't expecting anything unusual that evening. It was just another small community gathering at a friend's bookshop downtown, the kind of place where time feels slower, where the air carries the scent of paper, ink, and freshly brewed coffee. I came mostly out of habit, not excitement. But then, she walked in. At first, I didn't even notice her the way I should have. She didn't demand attention. She wasn't loud or dramatic. She simply carried herself with a quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't beg to be noticed but leaves you staring longer than you mean to. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, and there was something graceful about the way she moved through the crowd, as if she had learned to make space for herself in a world that often tried to overlook her. When she smiled at someone across the room, I realized that her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. And strangely, that small detail tugged at me more than anything else. It wasn't sadness exactly, it was distance, as though she'd taught herself to keep part of her heart carefully hidden. I didn't approach her right away. I watched her from across the room, the way she brushed her fingers over the spines of books, pausing now and then as if each title carried a memory. She seemed thoughtful, lost in her own rhythm. There was no one clinging to her, no one rushing to greet her with familiarity. She was present, yet somehow alone. When I finally gathered the courage to step closer, it wasn't with a rehearsed line. It was something simple, almost clumsy. She and I reached for the same book at the same time, an old poetry collection with a faded cover. Our fingers brushed, just barely, but it was enough to make me notice the warmth of her skin, delicate yet steady. She looked at me then, properly, for the first time. Her eyes were striking, not in the sense of color, but in depth. They carried stories, maybe even battles, and I found myself suddenly wanting to know all of them. "Sorry," I murmured, pulling my hand back quickly. Her lips curved into a soft smile, and this time it did touch her eyes, if only faintly. "No need to apologize," she said, her voice warm but slightly hushed, as if she wasn't used to being the center of attention. That tiny exchange should have ended there. But something in the silence afterward kept us both rooted, neither of us rushing away. It was as though the air between us had shifted, drawing us just a little closer. I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know her story. But in that moment, surrounded by books and quiet conversation, I felt the first flicker of something I couldn't name. And as she turned her gaze back to the shelves, her hand lingering for just a second longer on the book we'd both reached for, I had the sudden, undeniable thought, this woman is going to matter to me. I didn't think I'd get another chance to speak with her that evening, but fate seemed determined to prove me wrong. Later, when the gathering had quieted down, I found her sitting alone at a small table tucked near the corner of the shop. A half-finished cup of tea rested in front of her, steam curling into the soft glow of the hanging lights. Something about the scene, her posture, the way she absently stirred her tea with the spoon without really looking at it, felt both inviting and fragile. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should let her be. But before I could talk myself out of it, I pulled out the chair across from her and asked if it was taken. She shook her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. "No, please, sit." And so I did. What started as polite small talk stretched into something deeper before either of us realized it. She asked me what I did, where I grew up, questions that seemed casual but carried genuine curiosity. I answered, but I found myself steering the conversation back to her, wanting to know who she was beneath the surface. She told me she'd been divorced for almost 3 years. Not with bitterness. Not with drama. Just a fact, delivered with the quiet dignity of someone who had already lived through the hardest parts. There was no trace of self-pity in her words, only honesty, as if she had long stopped trying to sugarcoat her reality. I listened closely, more closely than I usually did with anyone else. Her voice carried a steadiness that was almost soothing, but every now and then, it dipped just slightly, like a note played softer, revealing the vulnerability she didn't intend to show. When she made a small, self-deprecating joke about not being anyone's first choice anymore, I instinctively reached across the table, my fingers brushing lightly against her wrist. "Don't say that," I murmured. It was automatic, unplanned, and when her eyes met mine in surprise, I pulled my hand back quickly, half embarrassed. But she didn't pull away. She only studied me for a moment, her lips pressed into the faintest, knowing smile. From there, the conversation shifted. We laughed about trivial things, favorite movies, misadventures in cooking, the small frustrations of daily life. But even those lighter topics carried a strange weight, because it wasn't the words themselves that mattered. It was the way her gaze lingered a little longer than necessary, the way her laughter softened something heavy inside me, and the way I caught myself memorizing the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Time slipped away from us. At one point, I glanced at the clock and realized an hour had passed, though it felt like minutes. The rest of the room faded, the chatter, the music, even the smell of coffee all became background to the quiet rhythm of our exchange. When the evening wound down and people began to leave, I realized I didn't want our conversation to end. And judging by the way she lingered too, her hands resting calmly on her cup though she hadn't taken a sip in ages, I sensed she felt the same. That night, as we finally stood and exchanged goodbyes, I walked out with the distinct feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was a connection that refused to be ignored. And as I replayed her words, her laughter, her glance back at me before she stepped out the door, I knew this was only the beginning. After that night at the bookshop, I found myself looking forward to seeing her again in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't about romance, not yet. It was something quieter, simpler, just the comfort of being around someone whose presence made the world feel softer. The next time we met, it was by coincidence. I was walking through the market on a late Saturday morning, the kind of place buzzing with voices, spices in the air, and vendors calling out over the crowd. And there she was, standing by a stall of fresh fruit, her arms already full with a paper bag that looked much too heavy. I almost laughed at the sight, her graceful composure fighting against the awkward juggle of apples and oranges threatening to spill out. Without thinking, I stepped in. "Here, let me help," I said, reaching for the bag before she could protest. For a moment, she looked ready to argue, that proud independence shining in her eyes. But then she sighed, a little smile tugging at her lips. "All right, thank you." I carried the bag with ease, though it wasn't about strength. It was about noticing. About being there without her needing to ask. We walked side by side through the crowded market, our shoulders brushing now and then. The sun filtered through strings of hanging cloth, casting shifting patterns of light across her face. I couldn't help but glance at her when she wasn't looking, memorizing the way her expression softened when she was lost in thought. She noticed, of course. She always did. "You don't have to play the gentleman, you know," she teased lightly. "Maybe I'm not playing," I replied before I could stop myself. She glanced at me then, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to respond but chose silence instead. That silence hung between us, not uncomfortable, more like an unspoken understanding neither of us dared to name. Later that week, the roles reversed. I was buried in work, exhaustion written across my face when she stopped by the same cafe I often studied in. I hadn't even seen her come in until a cup of coffee slid gently onto my table. "Looked like you needed this," she said simply, settling into the chair across from me. I blinked, surprised, then smiled. "You remembered how I take it?" Her eyes danced with quiet amusement. "Of course. I pay attention." It wasn't just the coffee. It was the way she noticed, the way she saw me when so many others barely did. That small act warmed me more than I wanted to admit. As days turned into weeks, these little exchanges became a rhythm between us. Carrying her groceries. Sharing an umbrella when the rain caught us off guard. Her straightening my collar absent-mindedly before we entered a room. They were small things, maybe even ordinary. But to me, they were everything. Every brush of her hand, every quiet gesture, carried a weight far heavier than words. And with each passing moment, I realized, I wasn't just helping her, and she wasn't just helping me. We were slowly, quietly, beginning to take care of each other. It happened on one of those evenings when time feels slower, when the air carries just enough coolness to remind you that the night is settling in. We had been at a small gathering, nothing formal, just a few friends, a mix of familiar faces and quiet chatter. But somehow, as always, she and I ended up lingering on the edges, talking to each other more than to anyone else. When the evening wound down, I offered to walk her to her car. The streets were calm, lit only by the pale glow of street lamps and the occasional passing headlights. Our footsteps echoed softly on the pavement, and though we didn't speak much at first, the silence between us felt companionable, almost sacred. At one point, she slowed her pace, her arms wrapped loosely around herself as though she needed the comfort of her own embrace. I noticed it immediately. "Are you cold?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not cold. Just thinking." We stopped near her car, the quiet hum of the night surrounding us. She leaned lightly against the door, her gaze drifting upward as if searching the stars for an answer she wasn't ready to say out loud. Then, after a long pause, her voice dropped to something softer, almost fragile. "You know, divorce does something to you," she began. "It's not just the loss of a marriage, it's the way you start to feel invisible. Like you've been left behind by the world somehow." Her words caught me off guard, not because of their meaning, but because of the honesty in them. She wasn't dramatizing it. She wasn't asking for pity. She was simply telling the truth, in that quiet, steady way she had. "I'm sorry," I said gently. "No one should ever make you feel that way." She gave a small laugh, though it carried no real amusement. "It's not about blame. It just makes you forget what it feels like to be wanted. To be chosen. You start to wonder if that part of your life is over." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. My instinct was to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that she was far too captivating to ever fade into the background. But I held back. Instead, I let the truth slip out in a softer, steadier tone than I expected. "You're more wanted than you realize," I said, my gaze fixed on hers. Her eyes met mine then, and the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken things. I could feel the warmth of her presence, the nearness of her hand just inches from mine. For a heartbeat, I almost reached out, almost let my fingers slide over hers. But hesitation caught me, fear of saying too much, too soon. She seemed to notice. Her lips parted as if to speak, then closed again, leaving the words unspoken. And though she didn't answer my confession directly, the way her eyes lingered on me told me enough. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. But it was a crack in the wall she had built around her heart. And for now, that was more than enough. The night it happened, the sky had opened up without warning. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, turning the streets into mirrors that reflected the blur of streetlights. We had been at the same cafe, talking the hours away as we so often did, when the storm arrived. By the time we stepped outside, the downpour was relentless. I held my umbrella out toward her. It was small, barely enough to cover one person, let alone two. She hesitated, then stepped closer, so close I could feel the warmth of her body just inches from mine. Together we walked slowly, pressed beneath the narrow shelter, our shoulders brushing with every step. The rain was loud, drumming on the umbrella, splashing against the pavement. Yet somehow, in that crowded sound, everything else felt muted. Her perfume was faint but unmistakable, blending with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Every breath I took seemed to pull me deeper into her orbit. At one point, the wind shifted, sending a spray of rain across her cheek. Without thinking, I reached up, brushing it away with the back of my hand. My thumb lingered near her skin, tracing just the edge of her jaw. Her eyes lifted to mine then, and the world seemed to stop. It was a gaze that lasted longer than it should have. Her lips parted slightly, as if she might say something, but no words came. My heart pounded in my chest, louder than the rain. I wanted, desperately, to close the distance, to let my hand slip from her cheek into her hair, to pull her into me. For a moment, I thought she wanted the same. She leaned in, just the faintest tilt forward, her breath mingling with mine. I could feel the heat of her so close, the electricity running like a live wire between us. But then, she stopped. Her body stiffened, her eyes lowering as she pulled back slightly. A whisper escaped her lips, almost lost in the storm. "I can't, not like this. I don't want to be someone's mistake." Her voice trembled, not with anger, but with fear, the kind of fear that comes from being hurt before, from giving too much and receiving too little in return. I dropped my hand slowly, though the ache in me begged otherwise. "You'd never be a mistake," I said softly. My words carried conviction, but I didn't press further. I respected the boundary, even if every part of me longed to cross it. We walked the rest of the way in silence, the umbrella forcing us to stay close though our hearts felt pulled apart. And when we reached her car, she gave me a look I'll never forget, full of longing, but also hesitation. That night, as I watched her drive away, the rain still pouring around me, I realized something important. Sometimes love doesn't grow in grand declarations or reckless moments. Sometimes it grows in the pauses, in the restraint, in the ache of what almost happened. And though I went home soaked and restless, I knew, the story between us was far from over. The days after the storm were quiet. Too quiet. She didn't call, and I didn't want to push. I replayed that moment under the umbrella again and again, the way she had leaned in, the way she had pulled back. It wasn't rejection. It was something more complicated, tangled in fears and memories I couldn't yet reach. When we finally saw each other again, it wasn't planned. I was sitting in that same cafe, staring blankly at a half-finished notebook page, when she walked in. My chest tightened instantly. She spotted me almost at once, and though there was hesitation in her steps, she came over. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, her tone light, almost playful. But her eyes gave her away. They carried a weight I hadn't seen before. "No," I said quietly, sliding my things aside. "It's yours." For a while, we just sat there, both of us pretending to focus on our drinks. The air between us was thick with unspoken words. Finally, she set her cup down and folded her hands, as though steadying herself. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice wasn't shaky, but it wasn't steady either. "That night, under the rain, it wasn't about you. It was about me. I've spent so long convincing myself I don't need anyone. That I can't trust anyone." She paused, her eyes fixed on the table. "When my marriage ended, I thought I'd buried the part of me that cared about being wanted. I told myself it didn't matter anymore. But with you," her voice broke slightly, and she drew in a breath. "With you, it's different. And that scares me." I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "Different how?" Finally, she lifted her gaze to mine, and in her eyes I saw something raw, unguarded. Her lips trembled just slightly as she whispered the words that would stay with me forever. "I forgot how good it feels to be wanted." The confession landed between us like a fragile truth, too delicate to disturb. My heart ached, not with pity, but with something far stronger. I wanted to tell her she had been wanted from the very first moment I saw her, that every glance, every touch, every silence between us had only deepened that truth. Instead, I reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When my hand covered hers, she didn't move. Her fingers curled into mine, hesitant at first, then firm. "You're not just wanted," I said softly. "You're needed. You're seen. You're you." Her eyes glistened, though she blinked the tears back before they could fall. She leaned ever so slightly toward me, resting her other hand on top of mine. For the first time, there was no wall, no hesitation, only the quiet relief of being understood. In that moment, we didn't need grand gestures or stolen kisses. The truth was already there, woven in the way her hand stayed in mine, in the way she allowed herself to be vulnerable at last. And I realized something too, this wasn't the fragile spark of infatuation. This was the beginning of something real, something steady, something worth waiting for. After that evening at the cafe, something shifted between us. There was no sudden rush, no grand transformation. It was quieter than that, gentler, steadier, like a door that had been locked for years finally opening just enough to let the light through. We didn't dive into labels or promises. Instead, we simply began to spend more time together. A walk in the park on a lazy Sunday afternoon. Cooking dinner side by side in her kitchen, where she laughed at the mess I made chopping onions. Sitting on her porch with mugs of tea as dusk settled in, listening to the world quiet down. What struck me most wasn't what changed, it was what didn't. She was still the same woman who carried herself with quiet confidence, who measured her words carefully, who sometimes drifted into silences that said more than speech. But now, when those silences came, she let me be part of them. She no longer seemed alone in them. One evening stands out most clearly in my memory. We had finished dinner, simple pasta, nothing elaborate, and were cleaning up together. She was drying a glass while I stacked plates, and without warning, she set the glass down, leaned against the counter, and just looked at me. It wasn't the kind of look you give out of politeness or habit. It was searching, soft, almost disbelieving. "What is it?" I asked, smiling a little nervously. She shook her head slowly. "I keep waiting for this to feel temporary. Like it's something that's going to slip away if I blink too long." I set the plates down, wiped my hands, and stepped closer until I was right in front of her. "Does it feel temporary right now?" Her eyes glistened in the kitchen's warm light. She shook her head again, her voice barely above a whisper. "No. It feels safe. It feels real." I reached for her hand, lacing my fingers gently with hers. Her skin was warm, her grip tentative for just a moment before it tightened. "That's because it is real," I said softly. "And I'm not going anywhere." She exhaled, as though letting go of something heavy she'd been carrying for years. Then, almost instinctively, she rested her head against my shoulder. I felt her cheek press lightly against me, her breath steady, her body relaxing in a way that told me she trusted this, trusted us. We stayed like that for a long while, not speaking, not needing to. Her hand stayed in mine, our fingers intertwined like they belonged there. As I held her, I realized something simple yet profound: love isn't always about grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it's about the quiet moments, the steady presence, the feeling of being seen and chosen, again and again. And that night, as we stood together in her kitchen, I knew this wasn't a fleeting chapter. This was the beginning of a story we were writing together, slowly, carefully, but with hearts finally unafraid. If this story touched you, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves slow burn romance, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps me keep bringing these moments to life.